In the early 70s, whenever you would tune in the Voice of Kenya, which today is called KBC, whenever you would be tuned in, sometime they would start talking about makaburu wa Afrika Kusini na walowezi wa Rhodesia. Makaburu were the Boers of South Africa. I've already talked about them. Walowezi were settlers of Rhodesia. Now that I've talked about makaburu wa Afrika Kusini, or the Boers of South Africa, now I will talk about walowezi wa Rhodesia, or settlers in Rhodesia. The picture you have seen is of Ian Douglas Smith, the last European leader of Rhodesia, before he handed over to Robert Gabriel Mugabe. Robert Gabriel Mugabe ruled that country for a very long time. Now I know when I mentioned Robert Gabriel Mugabe, you now know that Rhodesia nowadays is called Zimbabwe. It is now called Zimbabwe. I'll tell you the two names. Rhodesia derived its name from Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes. One day I'll talk about him. And then Zimbabwe, for my Kenyan view who come from coast area, you know a place called Gede ruins. So we had some ruins in Zimbabwe, in that country, and those ruins were called Zimbabwe. Just like in Kenya, we can decide to call the Kenyan country Gede ruins. So there is some old time ago ruins which were called Zimbabwe. So they call the country Zimbabwe. We used to have a confederation of countries, just like East African Community, which at one time they were even thinking of forming a United States of Africa or something like that. These were three countries. There was Nyasaland. Nyasaland today is called Malawi. Nyasaland today is called Malawi. There was the Northern and Southern Rhodesia. The Northern Rhodesia, upon gaining independence, it called itself Zambia. And Southern Rhodesia, remaining the only country being called Southern Rhodesia, they removed the name Southern Rhodesia and called themselves Rhodesia. So these three countries at one time, they wanted to form a confederation. Upon Northern Rhodesia becoming independent and calling itself Zambia, Southern Rhodesia continued calling itself just Rhodesia without the name Southern. And it continued that way. Shortly before independence, it changed its name to Zimbabwe-Rhodesia. Two names, Zimbabwe-Rhodesia. But once Comrade Mugabe took over, it changed to Zimbabwe up to the time of recording this video. You'll find that the settlers in Zimbabwe were different from the Boers in South Africa. I'm sure you have seen about South Africa, so I'll not repeat. These were people, in Kenya they even tried to do such a thing, White Islands. So these settlers, like the ones in Kenya and the White Islands, are the people now who started controlling Rhodesia, as it was known then. As they were controlling Rhodesia, the government was arranged in such a way that instead of it being a colony like any other, because colonies used to be ruled by a governor. A colony used to be ruled by governors, but Rhodesia was, yes, a colony with a governor, but the governor was figurative. They decided to have their own members of parliament, and they had MPs who elected a prime minister who was answerable to the Queen through the governor. Tomorrow is Madaraka Day. That is the arrangement that was in Kenya that time. That Kenya, we had a certain sort of independence, that we had a prime minister. Actually, it started off by chief minister, who was Ronald Ngala. Very many Kenyans don't know, because KANU was asked to form a government and KANU refused to form a government. So the small party formed the government, that coalition government, that is KADU. So we used to have a chief minister, and when Kenyatta left prison and joined politics, the chief minister was called prime minister. So the prime minister in Kenya, when Kenya gained independence, the prime minister was answerable to the governor at Government House. Government House nowadays is called State House. So Rhodesia then was the similar, that they had a parliament, they had their own Madaraka, they had a parliament for whites only. Parliament for whites only. Remember, the Kenyan had said was for Kenyan politicians, of which KANU refused to take over, blah, blah, blah. But that in Kenya was for all Kenyans, African, Asian, European, everybody. But in Rhodesia, it was only for the whites. The whites are the only ones who used to elect MPs. And the MPs, the party that won, formed the government under the governor. So in 1964 is when Northern Rhodesia became independent and was called Zambia. The following year, 1965, Ian Douglas Smith, the then Prime Minister of the colony of Rhodesia, declared a UDI, which means Unilateral Declaration of Independence. Rhodesia alone declared itself to be independent of Britain, and it was a country that was ruled by white Africans. White Africans. So they declared it was a UDI. For the Generation Z or Generation Z, I can compare that to Hargeisa. Hargeisa decided to cut themselves off Somalia and call themselves Somaliland. And they declared a UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. As the name unilateral says, it talks of you alone, unitary, you, one person, you declare, and no other country recognizes you. Or later on, a few countries will recognize you. How many countries do you have in the world? So if you are recognized by 20 countries, you are still deemed to be Unilateral Declaration of Independence. These people were just as bad as Makaburu wa Afrika Kusini, Boers of South Africa. So they continued, and people went to the forest. That is when Tanzania offered itself as a training ground for freedom fighters. So freedom fighters from all African countries that had not gained independence used to come for training. Just like I went for training, GSU training school in Magadi, these freedom fighters of all countries, including your Museveni, was trained in Tanzania. So they were trained there, and towards the end, There were two leading, there were several leading parties, but there were two leading. There was ZANU. You know, those days, any country that gained independence would want to start a party called ANU, African National Union. In Kenya, we had KANU. Tanzania, we had TANU. So in Zimbabwe, they had ZANU. ZANU, Zimbabwe African National Union. And we had ZAPU. But then, you know, especially Kenyans, you know that a popular party breaks into two. For the Kenya, for the Asili, for the people. That one, that is how people break. So, we had this, ZANU broke into several times, and even ZAPU. The other part was ZAPU. ZAPU was Zimbabwe African People's Union. Just like Kenya, we had KANU and KADU, Kenya African Democratic Union. But they had ZANU, Zimbabwe African National Union, and ZAPU, Zimbabwe African People's Union. That is when Comrade Robert Gabriel Mugabe was arrested and spent a lot of years in prison. While in prison, the goodness with Zimbabwe that Kenya only copied the other day is that you go to prison. If you're interested, you add up your education. Robert Mugabe has, I think he got 4 degrees from inside the prison. Before he was jailed, he married a Ghanaian lady, a very gracious lady. She was a freedom fighter in Ghana, and he was a freedom fighter in Zimbabwe. I told you that Tanzania offered a training ground for guerrillas, depending on whom you are. Some would call them guerrilla, others would call them freedom fighters. So they were training there. He got married to that lady, and when independence came in 1979. But just before independence, Ian Smith realized that without playing with without organizing with Africans, his government was going nowhere. His government was going nowhere. So he released Gabriel Mugabe. He released them. There were so many freedom fighters who were in the forefront. I remember them all. No, my neck top remembers them all. There was Reverend Abel Muzorewa of the ANC. Yes, you heard me well. African National Congress, Zimbabwe. There was Dambaningi Sidole, Bishop Dambaningi Sidole. There was Robert Gabriel Mugabe. There's this heavy fellow with a white hair, I'll remember him. He was considered the father of independence. So to make sure that he was called Joshua Nkomo. Yeah, he was called Joshua Nkomo. Now, Ian Douglas Smith, knowing very well that power will overtake him, he took that opportunity to befriend freedom-fighting political parties to join his government. The freedom political parties refused to join him. They refused to join him, and it is only Reverend Abel Muzorewa who joined him. Abel Muzorewa with his ANC joined him. That was around 1977-78. He joined him, and they formed a coalition government of the settlers and ANC of Abel Muzorewa. Both Abel Muzorewa and Ian Douglas Smith came up with a rank that was called co-prime minister. At that time, Rhodesia had two prime ministers, had two co-prime ministers. There was Reverend Abel Muzorewa, and there was Ian Douglas Smith. They were both co-premier. And they changed the name of the country. They changed the name of the country from Rhodesia and gave it a two name, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. But freedom fighters continued fighting for freedom in Zimbabwe extensively. That there was a problem. There was a problem that the joint government of Abel Muzorewa and Ian Douglas Smith could not rule well, and so for a very short time, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe reverted back to be a colony of Britain. That is when now Britain, being the colonial master, allowed them to use Lancaster House for their meeting. They started using Lancaster House for their meeting, and when they were meeting Lancaster House during their meetings, those who were in, there were three teams. There was Abel Muzorewa and Ian Douglas Smith. They were forming the government. And in the opposition, there were two groups. There is one which called itself Patriotic Front. Patriotic Front had ZAPU, one arm of the ZAPU, and it had one arm of the ZANU. Now ZANU, which was in Patriotic Front, was headed by Gabriel Mugabe, Robert Gabriel Mugabe. And the ZAPU was by Joshua Nkomo. But the ZANU, which, you know, ZANU was headed by Mugabe before he was jailed for around 10 years. When he was in jail, ZANU was taken over, just like Gishuru took over KANU and KADU, and headed by Reverend Dambaningi Sidole. Zimbabweans, have I pronounced well? Dambaningi Sidole. Now, when Gabriel came out, more educated and whatever, he wanted his party back. Dambaningi Sidole refused to hand over the party. So there were two types of, each one were calling itself ZANU. But when Patriotic Front, a coalition, Kenyans know about coalitions, a coalition came for Patriotic Front, then the leader of Patriotic Front was Joshua Nkomo. The leader of Patriotic Front was Joshua Nkomo. Deputy was Gabriel Mugabe. Gabriel Mugabe was the leader for deputy leader. So Joshua Nkomo came into that party with his ZAPU PF. ZAPU-PF. And Gabriel Mugabe came up with his ZANU PF. But the ZANU, the other one, remained out. They formed a third party with another ZAPU there. But the ZAPU without Mugabe, without Joshua Nkomo, and the ZANU without Mugabe, they were toothless. It is just like one time Ford Kenya was during Jaramogi's time, and you compare Jaramogi's time, you compare Ford Kenya with Wanyoike's Ford people. They are both Ford, but one is a paper Ford. That is how the parties that did not join Patriotic Front were parties that were paper parties. They were not really parties. So they entered into an agreement, and also these things are, they say history keeps on repeating itself. We can even say that Southern Sudan, when it was about to gain independence, Nani rushed one of the leaders rushed, and I'll forget the name, but he rushed and joined the Arabs in Khartoum. But when Southern Sudan became independent, Garang and the current president Dimabyor formed the government. So hii mambo ya this thing about, we have is Central Africa people watching. This issue of rushing to go and talk to the leaders for personal benefit did not start in South Sudan. Even in Kenya, we have a politician. He rushes when he's given something, he forgets you in the trenches. But it started in Zimbabwe, or even it started earlier, but I'm only aware that it started in Zimbabwe, where Abel Muzorewa rushed and joined the oppressors, and he was made a co-premier. Elections were held in 1979. When elections were held, this is the problem in Africa, in Kenya, in Zimbabwe. Joshua Nkomo came from a smaller tribe than Joshua Nkomo came from a smaller tribe than Gabriel Mugabe. So when they went down to Joshua Nkomo wanted them to face the campaign as Patriotic Front, but Mugabe knew that if they go for Patriotic Front, Joshua Nkomo would lead the country. So him coming from a major tribe, that was how the Patriotic Front broke. They went for elections, and Mugabe, coming from a major tribe, he won the elections. When he won the elections, remember, Zimbabwe became a Westminster type of government. If you check on my first recordings, you'll find I've already recorded a very different types of constitution. Westminster type of government is that the prime minister is the executive. He's the overall, is everything, but the president is ceremonial. So when they went for 1979 general elections, there was Mugabe's party won because it had many members, and it nominated Reverend Canon Banana, Reverend Canon Banana, to be the ceremonial president. Reverend Canon Banana became the ceremonial president, and African countries started pushing Mugabe and saying, now you see Joshua Nkomo, you fought with him, whatever. Now he's going to be an opposition member, just an ordinary MP. Then they agreed that they form the coalition government, where Joshua Nkomo was a deputy prime minister. But being number two, I think those who are near Gachagua can ask him. He'll tell you number two is not the best work. So somehow Nkomo and Mugabe disagreed, and Nkomo left politics. He later died, and Mugabe made sure that he was given a state funeral. So Mugabe continued ruling in Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe was a very good country because you have a PhD president, and he is a very good first lady who was from Ghana. So the country went on well. The problems in Zimbabwe, as I finish off my 30 minutes, the problem in Zimbabwe came when the first lady became seriously ill, and it was known that she was going to die. It was only, I think it could be cancer. You know, when you have cancer, you just know you're going to die. So she became sick, and rumors started spreading that the executive secretary of the president, is dating the president. Actually, the politician who said that was jailed. The politician who said that was jailed, and the first lady died. Immediately the first lady died. Within a short time, Gabriel Mugabe married the slave queen. And that is how the Gabriel Mugabe went down, and that is how Zimbabwe went down, because of this lady alone. There is something I had forgotten, which I'll finish as. You see, when Zimbabwe got independent, it was a Westminster government, and the president was Reverend Canon Banana, Kama, that fruit, it's called banana, and he was a reverend. He was the ceremonial president. But Africa during those days, they were going to the dictatorship where the president is both the president and the prime minister. So all African countries, it's not just Zimbabwe. Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta was the prime minister, he became the president. Tanzania, we had Nyerere, who was the prime minister, he became the president. Uganda, there was a coalition between the Kabaka, who was the president, and Obote, the prime minister. So the Obote used Amin and the army to chase away the king, who was the president, and Obote assumed both the prime minister and the president. So Africa, every country started going for the president who was all-powerful, almighty. So Zimbabwe also followed suit. And as I've said, Zimbabwe was a good story. It is only when Mugabe married the slave queen that she spoiled the country. And even now, Mnangagwa will definitely not bring it back to where it is supposed to be. I think it will take 2 or 3 governments. Thank you.